liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
The world tuned in, breath held, ready to witness a moment of triumph, a new chapter in human exploration.
6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff.
Instead, it became a front-row seat to tragedy, broadcast in real time.
We do have a problem, Bob. It looks as if it may have lost a solid rocket booster.
But what if the story we were told wasn't the whole truth? What if the Challenger disaster was more than just a catastrophic failure? What if it was a calculated cover-up by one of the US administrations? A recent discovery, a strange relic tied to that day, holds secrets no one was ever supposed to find. Could the disaster have been prevented? What secrets were buried with it? There's a version to the Challenger story you've never heard. Come, let's uncover it together. The world witnessed a live horror show on the 28th of January, 1986, as the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded just after liftoff. But before that dark day, there was the night before, a day that could have changed history. The day before, disaster struck. It was just like any other evening, same routine. Americans were winding down for the night. Meanwhile, a small group of engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company behind the Space Shuttle's solid rocket boosters, were locked in a desperate fight. They weren't battling numbers or deadlines. They were trying to stop a disaster they could see coming like a freight train. At the center of that long, tense night was Bob Ebeling, a senior engineer who would carry the burden of that night for the rest of his life. Alongside Roger Boisjoli, Arnie Thompson, Joel Maw, and Brian Russell, Ebeling had uncovered something chilling, literally. On January 27, 1986, the forecast at Kennedy Space Center predicted a low temperature of 18 degrees Fahrenheit by launch time, the coldest conditions ever for a shuttle launch. That might not sound like much, but to these engineers, it was a red flag screaming at full volume. Here's what the public never knew. The rubber O-rings, the tiny crucial seals on the shuttle's booster rockets, weren't designed for this kind of cold. And they had the data to prove it. This wasn't just a hunch or a worst-case scenario scribbled on a napkin. They had documented O-ring erosion, blow-by, photos, test results, even mathematical models. The evidence was everywhere, and it all said the same thing. Launching in that cold would be a death sentence. Ebeling and his team pleaded for a delay. They made their case, backed by science, by history, by fear. But NASA said no. That no wasn't just a decision. It was the first step toward one of the most avoidable tragedies in space history. A giant under pressure. The idea of postponing the launch? Unthinkable. Not because it was unsafe, but because NASA was cornered by pressure from all sides. The launch had already been delayed more than once, and another slip would make the agency look weak, indecisive, even incompetent. Behind the scenes, the stakes were political as much as they were technical. There was a national spotlight fixed on Christa McAuliffe, the teacher-turned-astronaut set to inspire a generation. And with President Reagan's State of the Union address fast approaching, the pressure to get her into space in time was immense. Delay the launch, and NASA risked not only public embarrassment, but the loss of critical support and funding from the government. So they moved forward, not because it was the right choice, but because turning back felt impossible. And what happened next is perhaps the most chilling part of the entire story. Under direct pressure from NASA, Morton Thiokol's management made a decision that would echo in their consciences for years to come. They asked the engineers, the very people who had raised red flags, presented evidence, and begged for a delay, to leave the room. Then, behind closed doors, and without a single new data point or shred of engineering analysis, they reversed the original recommendation. They approved the launch. Just like that. The people who best understood the danger, the engineers, were effectively silenced. They walked out of that room knowing exactly what would happen next. And still, the countdown continued. The attempts at a cover-up. In the immediate aftermath of the Challenger disaster, NASA launched what can only be described as a coordinated effort to control public perception and minimize organizational responsibility. This cover-up attempt reveals how institutional self-preservation can corrupt even the most prestigious scientific organizations. Within hours of the disaster, NASA officials were already crafting talking points that minimized the role of organizational failure. Initial press releases described the explosion as an anomaly and suggested that such incidents were an inevitable risk of space exploration. There was no mention of the engineering warnings that had been ignored or the political pressures that had influenced launch decisions. The most shocking aspect of NASA's response was the systematic suppression of internal documents that revealed the extent of pre-launch concerns. Morton Thiokol engineers were instructed not to discuss their temperature analysis with investigators, and NASA officials claimed that technical concerns had been adequately addressed through normal review processes. This stonewalling strategy nearly worked. Initial media coverage focused on the technical complexity of space travel and the inherent risks of exploration. It wasn't until investigative journalists began questioning inconsistencies in NASA's official timeline that the truth began to emerge. The breakthrough came when Alan McDonald, Morton Thiokol's director of the Solid Rocket Motor Project, decided to break ranks and testify honestly before the Rogers Commission. McDonald revealed that he had refused to sign the launch recommendation on January 27th and had been present during the heated teleconference with NASA officials. McDonald's testimony opened the floodgates. Other engineers began coming forward with their own accounts of ignored warnings and suppressed concerns. Roger Boisjoli provided the commission with his detailed temperature analysis and photographs of O-ring damage from previous flights. But NASA's cover-up attempts didn't end with the Rogers Commission investigation. The agency continued to minimize the role of organizational failure in its official reports and training materials for years afterwards. It wasn't until the Columbia disaster in 2003 that NASA finally acknowledged the systemic cultural problems that had contributed to both tragedies. The most disturbing aspect of NASA's cover-up was the treatment of whistleblowing engineers. Both Alan McDonald and Roger Boisjoli faced professional retaliation for their honest testimony. McDonald was demoted and reassigned to lesser responsibilities, while Boisjoli was ostracized by colleagues and eventually left the aerospace industry entirely. This retaliation sent a clear message to other potential whistleblowers. Telling the truth about safety concerns would destroy your career. Speaking of careers, don't forget to like this video to save ours as we talk about the unseen heroes of the Challenger disaster. And evidence from the past. The O-ring failure wasn't a random mechanical problem that came up at the last minute. It was a predictable consequence of flawed design and inadequate testing that engineers had been documenting for years. The solid rocket boosters of the space shuttle were assembled in segments, with each joint sealed by two giant rubber O-rings, a primary and a secondary seal. In theory, if the primary seal failed, the secondary would prevent hot gases from escaping. Now, here lies the critical flaw that NASA management didn't want to acknowledge. Both the primary and secondary O-rings in the field joint of the right solid fuel rocket booster were burned through by hot gases. Boisjoli, one of the engineers, had been conducting extensive testing on O-ring performance since 1985. His data showed a clear correlation between temperature and seal effectiveness. At temperatures below 65 degrees Fahrenheit, the rubber became so stiff that it couldn't maintain proper seal compression. At 32 degrees or below, the temperature expected on launch morning, the O-rings would be virtually useless. Along with this news was an even more shocking fact. There had been O-ring damage from previous flights, and NASA had evidence of them all. What this proved was that these were not isolated incidents, but were warning signs of a recurring issue. The most damning evidence came from a post-flight analysis of mission STS-51C in January 1985. This mission launched in a relatively cold weather at 53 degrees Fahrenheit and experienced the most severe O-ring damage to date. The primary O-ring was completely eroded, and the secondary seal showed significant damage. If the burn-through had been just slightly worse, that shuttle would have exploded as well. The engineers at Morton Thiokol created detailed presentations showing this. They had statistical analyses, engineering calculations, and photographic evidence proving that cold weather launches were unacceptably dangerous. But NASA management dismissed these concerns as not conclusive and argued that the shuttle had flown successfully in cold weather before. However, this argument revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of risk assessment. Just because previous cold weather launches hadn't resulted in catastrophic failure didn't mean they were safe. It simply meant they were lucky. The engineers understood this distinction, but management chose to interpret past success as proof of future safety. Perhaps the most disturbing of all was NASA's own safety protocols that required any single-point failure mode to be eliminated from the shuttle design. The O-ring system was classified as a criticality 1 component, meaning that its failure would result in loss of vehicle and crew. Despite this classification, NASA continued to fly with a known deficiency in the seal design, intentionally setting up a crew for a fatal disaster. Untold stories and unsung heroes. Behind the corporate failures and political pressures that led to the Challenger disaster were individual engineers who risked their careers to prevent tragedy. Their stories represent the best of engineering ethics and the worst of organizational dysfunction. Bob Ebeling was one of 5 booster rocket engineers at a NASA contractor who tried to stop the 1986 launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger, which exploded just 73 seconds into its flight. For the rest of his life, Ebeling carried the burden of feeling that he hadn't done enough to prevent the disaster. In a 2016 interview, just months before his death, Ebeling revealed the emotional toll of the Challenger disaster. In his statements, he reflected on the impossible position that ethical engineers found themselves in when confronting organizational pressure to remain silent. On the other hand, Roger Boisjoli's story is equally tragic. As the lead O-ring specialist, he had the most detailed understanding of the seal problems and had been documenting his concerns for months. His July 1985 memo predicting catastrophe of the highest order was a desperate attempt to force NASA to address known deficiencies in the shuttle design. After the disaster, Boisjoli became a vocal advocate for engineering ethics and corporate responsibility. He testified before Congress, spoke at universities, and wrote extensively about the moral obligations of engineers to prioritize public safety over corporate loyalty. But his whistleblowing came at enormous personal cost. He was effectively blacklisted from the aerospace industry and struggled with depression and post-traumatic stress for years. Alan McDonald's story is perhaps the most inspiring example of moral courage in the entire Challenger saga. As Morton Thiokol's representative at Kennedy Space Center, McDonald was in the unique position of being able to halt the launch even after his company's management had approved it. On the morning of January 28th, he refused to sign the final flight readiness certification, telling NASA officials that he wouldn't be responsible for killing the crew. But McDonald's protest was overruled by NASA management, who found other officials willing to sign the necessary paperwork. The launch proceeded despite his objections, vindicating his concerns in the most tragic way possible. What makes these engineers true heroes is their combination of technical expertise and moral clarity. They understood both the specific risks of cold weather launches and the broader ethical implications of proceeding despite known dangers. Their warnings weren't based on abstract theories or overcautious speculation. They were grounded in solid engineering analysis and professional experience. The teacher in space. Krista McAuliffe was a schoolteacher selected as part of the crew members for the Challenger shuttle. But her story is more tragic than inspirational. It's a cautionary tale on political pressure overriding safety protocols. The Teacher in Space program was President Reagan's brainchild, designed to restore public interest in the space program and demonstrate that space travel had become routine enough for civilians. But here's what NASA never publicized. The selection of a teacher for this mission created unprecedented political pressure that compromised safety decisions. McAuliffe wasn't just another crew member, she was a symbol of American education and achievement. Her presence on the shuttle meant millions of schoolchildren would be watching the launch live, and this was supposed to create a media spectacle that NASA couldn't afford to postpone. Originally, the launch date for the space shuttle was January, but weather delays and technical issues had pushed it back repeatedly, and with each delay, the political pressure increased exponentially. President Reagan had planned to mention the mission during his State of the Union address in January. But this only succeeded in creating an artificial deadline that had nothing to do with the readiness of the shuttle. What's even more shocking is that McAuliffe wasn't supposed to be NASA's first choice. Initially, candidates with more technical backgrounds were deemed a better choice, but again, political considerations ultimately prevailed. The Teacher in Space program was designed more for public relations than scientific advancement. But even then, another delay after the concerns were raised was going to be a nightmare. Previously, NASA had successfully launched several shuttle missions, creating a false sense of confidence that the shuttle system was fully operational and safe. But perhaps the most tragic update is that McAuliffe herself was aware of the delays and the pressure surrounding her mission. In interviews conducted just days before the launch, she expressed both excitement and nervousness about the flight. She had been training for almost a year and was fully committed to the mission's educational goals. In the end, her trust in NASA and the government became her undoing. The chilling last words. Commander Dick Scobie, pilot Michael Smith, mission specialists Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Ronald McNair, payload specialist Gregory Jarvis, and teacher Krista McAuliffe deserved better. They trusted NASA's assurances that the shuttle was safe and reliable. They had no way of knowing that engineers were desperately trying to prevent their deaths, while management ignored critical safety warnings. The recovery of the crew compartment took 73 days and cost millions of dollars. When it was finally brought to the surface, investigators found evidence that the crew had attempted to regain control of their situation. Switches had been moved to emergency positions, and emergency procedures had been initiated. This evidence contradicts NASA's initial claims that the crew was unaware of the disaster. In reality, they likely experienced a terrifying period of awareness as their spacecraft broke apart around them. Reports showed that the pilot said, "uh-oh," in their final moments, a telling that they somehow knew they were doomed. The discovery that started it all. The mystery of the Challenger space shuttle remained what it was for a long time, a mystery. But all of that changed when a discovery no one would have expected turned up out of nowhere. After the tragic event, NASA launched a rescue attempt, which only recovered the bodies of the crew and parts of the shuttle that could be found. The rest? Left to fate as they had sunk to the bottom of the ocean. In a surprising twist of fate, a 20-foot piece of the shuttle was discovered in 2022, decades after the initial wreckage. This piece was discovered by a film crew who were exploring the ocean floor and documenting their finds for a documentary on World War II. Imagine their surprise as they stumbled on a large fragment of the Challenger shuttle. The NASA branding of water tiles was unmistakable, and when they resurfaced, this piece was confirmed to be part of the ill-fated shuttle that crashed as it took off. On one hand, this discovery was a good thing. On the other hand, it brought back memories of lives lost, especially that of Krista McAuliffe. However, NASA acknowledged this find and announced that it will remain undisturbed at the site as a solemn reminder of those who lost their lives and a tragic day in spaceflight history. a day that shook the world. In the morning of the launch, Challenger loomed against the pale morning sky like a technological cathedral. But even from a distance, the crew could see something was wrong. The shuttle was covered in ice, but despite that, the order to launch had already been given. One by one, they entered Challenger's crew compartment, with Scobie and Smith taking their positions on the flight deck, surrounded by hundreds of switches, gauges, and computer displays. Behind them, the mission specialists settled into their seats, running through final checklists with the methodical precision that had kept the shuttle program safe for 20 previous flights. As the countdown entered its final phase, radio chatter between the shuttle and mission control was crisp, efficient, and routine. Weather updates confirmed what everyone already knew. It was cold, colder than any previous shuttle launch. But the ice inspection teams had cleared the vehicle for flight. The range safety officer had given the go-ahead. The flight director had polled his team and received unanimous approval. All systems were functioning normally. In the passenger compartment, Krista McAuliffe reviewed her lesson plans one final time. In just a few hours, she would be floating in zero gravity, conducting the first classroom lesson from space. After liftoff, the Challenger accelerated 7 human beings from 0 to 100 miles per hour in 6 seconds. Everything was proceeding normally. The shuttle was performing flawlessly, its systems operating within design parameters. In mission control, flight controllers monitored hundreds of data streams, all showing nominal performance. But 900 miles away in Utah, Roger Boisjoli sat in his office, staring at a television screen, knowing that somewhere in the incomprehensible complexity of Challenger's propulsion system, rubber seals were already failing. At 46,000 feet, traveling at nearly 2,000 miles per hour, Challenger encountered the worst possible combination of aerodynamic forces and structural stress. The failed O-ring, exactly as Boisjoli had predicted, had allowed superheated gas to escape from the right solid rocket booster. That escaping gas had been burning through the external fuel tank's support structure for over a minute, invisible to the crew, undetectable by most of the shuttle's sensors. The tank was structurally compromised, but it didn't explode, it ruptured, releasing 500,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen and oxygen into the atmosphere. The chemical reaction created a spectacular fireball that made the world believe it was an explosion. The shuttle itself and the cabin that carried the crew broke away from this fireball completely intact. For several seconds, Challenger continued flying, its pilots likely unaware that they were no longer attached to their fuel source. The crew compartment fell thousands of feet in 2 minutes and 45 seconds. When the crew compartment finally hit the Atlantic Ocean, 7 dreams ended, and a nation was left in shock. A killer decision. The Challenger disaster wasn't just a technical failure. It was the result of a corporate culture that prioritized schedule and budget over human safety. The relationship between NASA and its contractors in the 1980s created a perfect storm of conflicting incentives that made tragedy inevitable. Morton Thiokol was under enormous financial pressure to maintain their contract with NASA. The solid rocket booster program was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and any significant delays or safety concerns could jeopardize future business. This created a culture where engineering concerns were viewed as obstacles to profitability rather than essential safety considerations. Internal company documents, revealed during congressional hearings, show that Morton Thiokol executives were more concerned about their relationship with NASA than the safety implications of their products. The pressure worked exactly as intended. Jerry Mason, Morton Thiokol's senior vice president, made the fateful decision to override his engineers and approve the launch. In testimony before the Rogers Commission, Mason admitted that his decision was based on maintaining good relations with NASA rather than technical considerations. But NASA's own culture was equally problematic. The agency had evolved from the mission-focused organization of the Apollo era into a bureaucratic institution more concerned with political survival than exploration. Budget cuts throughout the 1970s and early 1980s had forced NASA to justify the shuttle program based on routine, frequent flights rather than extraordinary achievements. This created what investigators later called schedule pressure, an organizational fixation on meeting launch dates regardless of technical readiness. NASA had promised Congress and the public that the shuttle would fly at least 24 times per year, making space travel as routine as commercial aviation. This ambitious schedule required shortcuts in testing, maintenance, and safety protocols. The most revealing aspect of NASA's corporate culture was revealed in internal communications during the weeks leading up to the Challenger launch. Officials discussed the perception problem created by repeated delays, with some suggesting that another postponement would damage the program's credibility with Congress and the public. Lawrence Malloy, NASA's booster project manager, embodied this misguided thinking. When Morton Thiokol engineers presented their temperature concerns, Malloy responded by asking them to prove that it was unsafe to launch, rather than requiring NASA to prove that it was safe. This reversal of the burden of proof represented a fundamental corruption of engineering ethics. The truth remains that both NASA and Morton Thiokol had competent, dedicated engineers who understood the risks and tried to prevent the disaster. But corporate structures and cultural pressures systematically suppressed their expertise in favor of schedule adherence and customer satisfaction. The crew that died twice. One of the most persistent myths about the Challenger disaster is that the crew died instantly when the shuttle exploded. This comforting lie was propagated by NASA and media outlets to spare families and the public from a more horrifying truth. Recent analysis of recovered debris and flight data reveals a far more tragic reality. The explosion that viewers witnessed on television wasn't actually an explosion in the traditional sense. It was a structural breakup after the external fuel tank ruptured. Essentially, the shuttle came apart, but the overflow of fuel reacting with oxygen caused a significant fire that looked like an explosion. The crew compartment remained largely intact during this initial breakup and continued flying upward for another 25 seconds before beginning its fatal descent toward the ocean. This means that the 7 crew members were likely conscious and aware during at least part of their 3-minute fall from 65,000 feet to the ocean surface. Emergency air packs found in the wreckage showed that at least 3 crew members had activated their oxygen supplies, indicating that they were alive and attempting to respond to the emergency. The crew compartment hit the ocean at approximately 200 miles per hour, generating an impact force far beyond human survival limits. But the knowledge that these brave individuals may have been conscious during their fall adds an additional layer of tragedy to an already devastating story. Imagine that scenario: being in a shuttle doomed from the start, surviving the initial breakup, falling freely in a cabin without an engine, no communications and guidance from the rest of the world, only to face death in a horrifying way. The aftermath that changed NASA forever. The Challenger disaster forced NASA to confront fundamental flaws in its organizational culture and technical practices. The changes that followed were comprehensive and long-lasting, beginning a process that transformed how the agency approached safety, risk assessment, and decision-making. The most visible change was the complete redesign of the solid rocket booster joints. Morton Thiokol engineers, working under intense scrutiny, developed a new joint design that eliminated the temperature sensitivity problems that had caused the Challenger explosion. The new design included additional O-rings, improved joint geometry, and extensive testing protocols. But it didn't end there. The technical changes were only part of NASA's transformation. The agency established new safety oversight organizations, including the Office of Safety, Reliability, and Quality Assurance, which reported directly to the NASA administrator rather than program managers. This organizational change was designed to ensure that safety concerns would receive high-level attention rather than being filtered through program management. NASA also implemented new decision-making processes that required explicit approval from multiple levels of management before proceeding with launches in marginal conditions. These processes were designed to prevent the kind of rushed decision-making that had characterized the night before Challenger's launch. The agency's relationship with contractors also changed significantly. New contractual requirements mandated that engineering concerns be communicated directly to NASA rather than being filtered through contractor management. This change was specifically designed to prevent the suppression of engineering dissent that had occurred at Morton Thiokol. Perhaps most importantly, NASA began acknowledging the inherent risks of spaceflight rather than promoting the shuttle as a routine transportation system. This cultural shift was reflected in more conservative flight schedules, more thorough risk assessments, and more honest communication about the dangers faced by astronaut crews. The shuttle program resumed flying in September 1988 with the successful launch of Discovery on mission STS-26. The gap between Challenger and return to flight was the longest suspension of a U.S. human spaceflight. However, the changes implemented after Challenger weren't sufficient to prevent all future tragedies. The Columbia disaster in 2003 revealed that NASA had reverted to many of the same cultural patterns that had contributed to Challenger, including normalization of deviance, schedule pressure, and suppression of engineering concerns. So does it mean NASA didn't learn from their past mistakes? We may never know. If you enjoyed this video, hit the subscribe button to stay notified for more interesting videos such as these. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.